in orthodontics. There is the opportunity to produce questions if you do that via the Q&A function, and I'll either interject as we go along with Fraser or we'll save them to the end. So I look forward to your talk tonight, Fraser, as our largest number ever of attendees. Please talk about mechanics in orthodontics. Thank you, Fraser.
Right, thank you all. Let me share my screen. I'm looking to you, John. Can you see that screen? Yeah, you're on mute. Good. Let's get that out of the way. Right. I can't talk too much about mechanics because most of it is learnt over a 3-year period. So I'm just going to go through basic principles of mechanics and give you a couple of references. Like most things, and I'm going to irritate everybody because those that have heard this will be really fed up with me saying it, but tough, you're going to get it again. There's a famous Chinese proverb that basically says, if I catch fish for you today, I will feed you for today. If I teach you to fish, I'll feed you the rest of your lives. And with all the pressures on orthodontics at the moment to reduce its academic base, you've really got to learn to know what are the references that are useful and what are the references that aren't. And in addition to that, you've also got to put aside all this glossy media coverage of how we're going to advertise all these various aligner treatments in particular to say they're worthwhile. But you've got to look at things with a very objective view. And the famous saying that was said to me many times when I was put down by the QCs, Professor McDonald, do not raise your voice to improve your argument, just simply improve your argument. So let's go through the things that we can. So where's the next one? All right. So the 3 aims or objectives: identify the interaction of the archway and the slot, establish the common misconceptions in orthodontic mechanics, and to identify typical issues associated with alignment. Now, it's all going to be merged into one. We're not going to have many clinical things, but hopefully you will start to ask questions yourself next time you pick up bits and pieces with regard to orthodontic equipment that in theory should be fairly standardized. You're also not going to be surprised that any academic usually talks about stuff they've actually investigated, and there will be a smattering of that. You'll also recognize 1 or 2 names. But it is really up to you as individuals to start to develop a discrimination as to which are the good names in orthodontics, the ones you want to listen to, the ones that actually have value to add. And we're looking at bracket dimensions, molar tube dimensions, archwire dimensions, and lacebacks. And why do we interest ourselves in all this? Well, obviously we want to improve our rate of orthodontic tooth movement. We want to ensure the correct angulation of teeth, tip, and to ensure the correct inclination of teeth. It won't surprise you that I have a underlying theme that a lot of what we've been taught of orthodontics is actually not really based on that much scientific fact. We used to see patients every 4 weeks. Now we've slipped it to 6 weeks, 8 weeks. Is there a justification for how often we should see our patients? The other big myth in orthodontics that's fairly limited in terms of what data there is out there is that we're always taught, certainly as undergraduates, and I don't know that it's changed, that teeth will move at 1 millimetre a month. I'm not sure that's right. But if you think of this, 1 millimetre a month, a standard class 1 case with crowding, loss of a premolar unit in each quadrant, should take us 3 to 5 months to treat if we're efficient. If we're optimistic, we might complete treatment within 12 to 15 months. I must admit, one of the few treatments that I ever witnessed going very quickly was 9 months, and the patient had started some growth hormone replacement therapy. So are our mechanics inefficient? And if we look at this case here, you can see crowded, we're going to take out the premolars, and in theory, we move the buccal segments forwards 3.5 millimeters. At the same time, we should be retracting the canine and aligning the lower incisors 3.5 millimeters. But does that take 3 to 5 months? By all means, again, in the pyramid of evidence, lectures are probably the lowest form of evidence. because they're opinion rather than anything else. And you can only really get evidence from these if you go away and think about this and actually start to apply the logic of it in your own clinical practice. So this is the first bit we're going to look at. We have the slot. Don't forget there are two sorts of bracket slots. There's 0.018 and there's 0.022 of an inch. Most of you use the 0.022, the reason being that in order to actually have the 0.018 as any value, it's a very, very precise system. And a lot of us, including myself, don't really have the precision skills to be able to use 0.018 as well as we should do. So the 0.022 slot is one that actually covers up most of our imperfections. And we are, after all, human beings. Just to remind you of the archwire materials, stainless steel, 18.8. I put that because the number of people that seem to forget about the 18.8. Most of stainless steel is iron. But obviously we have the 18.8. The 8 is the nickel, which is responsible for the type 4 hypersensitivity, except if you look at the data, it's not really that responsible because we can never find that level of nickel leaching out of even nickel titanium archwires. And we all seem to blame it on the cheap jewelry beforehand. But actually, do orthodontists really have this issue? I don't know. So for the next generation, we need to come up with some proper science behind it. The other types of archwire materials, alloy, wrought cobalt chrome, as opposed to the famous cast cobalt chrome we used to use for dentures. The nickel titaniums you can use, the superelastics, the tungsten molybdenum alloys, copper nitide. Famous question is what percentage of copper is there in copper nitide? And we mustn't really forget the braided stainless steel wires that are out there. They're cheaper than a lot of these arch wires, and I would suggest to any of you go to a show and have a look at the cost of some of the arch wires. You know, a lot of conferences, I would say the trade shows are sometimes more valuable than the actual lectures. But there are two sorts of braided stainless steel. There's the round stainless steel and there's the direct or rectangular braided steel. All of those, you are all children of the nation where you can search. Please don't use Google because Google keeps your history. Obviously, if you're in China, you can't use Google. It's banned to, if I recall. But one of the best ones is DuckDuckGo because it doesn't keep your history and you're able to actually search without these irritating adverts coming in. Remembering the archwire sizes, yes, I was brought up on 0.010, which we used to use as the initial archwire, a bit like fuse wire, and it used to work very well unless the patient was one of these that damages the archwire. But you have all the round wires going up to 020, you have all the rectangular types. I'm not suggesting in any way that I'm giving you all the arch wires. I am suggesting these are a selection. I would also say to you, when you do set up practices after you've qualified as an orthodontist, you'll need to take a view of which arch wires you need. Some clinicians say you might as well use 016 nickel titanium as your initial aligning arch wire. Or others would say you need to start at 012 and 014. Personally, I've got limited time I can spend ordering these arch wires. I'd rather keep the amount down in practice to a minimum. The 21-25 arch wires, I'd like you to actually, if you do use some of them, to actually objectively look when you come to fit them and see how easy they are to fit, because they are quite interesting. And I do have a theory about it, but it's a theory that, like most academics, you can always come up with a question that doesn't really have an answer. But see how easy they are to fit. Just to start off with showing off exactly what I used to do, it shows you there are some very strange publications associated with Mr. McDonald. We wanted to look, when we originally started using nickel titanium arch wires with ceramics and stainless steel, there was a big difference. And we were starting to see some of the arch wires actually shredded by the ceramic brackets, and it did definitely slow up treatment, particularly if you're looking for arch wires to slide along. Now, we do know that most arch wires walk along the arch wire, that is, they tip, the edge binds to the bracket, and then the tooth uprights, and they walk along effectively. The other thing you also have to remember in orthodontics, which is one of the great myths, we don't use continuous forces because you're using them in the patient's mouth. And in the patient's mouth, it's always superimposed with masticatory forces. And again, we have this discussion, and it's for another time, I'm sure, that the 30-gram force is essential for tooth movement. Yet we know that some of the appliances we use will generate 1 and 2 kilograms. We also know that masticatory forces can be up to 5 kilograms. And what you should be looking at is facial forms. And we know that those large masseters apply quite significant loads to the dentition. But what we're able to show is that the stainless steel bracket, the base of it, looked very much smoother. And if you looked close up, there were only a few imperfections. But with the same magnifications, the base of the ceramic bracket looked scalloped, there looked to be irregularities. And then when you look close up, you can see the crystals that were actually coming through. Now, we all know that there's been a change in the way the brackets have been prepared. We know that there's a metal insert. But do remember that these ceramic brackets, they do have advantages, and I'll come on to those in a bit, but they also do have disadvantages in that they're not the smoothest of material that you're working with. The other big thing that people make a huge issue of, and this is probably the one theme I want you to take away from these sort of 45, 50 we're going to do, is everybody seems to think that they can apply mathematical formula to the way that we use the fixed appliances, and that is the outcome of our clinical treatment. I think the final thing I would like you to do, which I'll show you at the very end, don't go by what is on the packet. Go by what you see clinically rather than what you see on the packet. There's a very good paper, which I haven't given you the full thing here, by Phil Benson, where he compared the final output of MBT and Roth treatment cases. And the clinicians couldn't tell the difference. So all these theoretical concepts of how much torque, yes, you do need to know it, and certainly in the exam, there will be a problem if people do not mention what the values are, but you do need to know what the degrees of torque are for upper incisors in MBT, Roth, straight wire, and any other prescription you're going to use. But the important thing of all this is, which is really interesting, this is down to Alex Cash, who's come up with some of this information, that basically, when you talk about size in America and you talk about size in Europe, there is about a 10% difference of the same measurements, which is an interesting concept when you think about where you're purchasing your goods from. The other thing that has been mentioned a lot of times, and there's this mad dash for everybody to get into 1925 stainless steel wires as their working arch wire. But in the standard bracket system of 022 by 028, we're supposed to have a working arch wire of 1925, but that is supposed to have 7 to 10 degrees of slop. Now, if we look at the MBT system, that has -6 degrees of torque. So how does that equate with the 7 to 10 degrees of slop that exists when you're using your working arch wire? And it goes back, I hope that you look at things clinically rather than look at things from what's on the packet. Going back to this, we have the Ormlast placed around holding the arch wire in place, and we'll come up to some details here. But a little simple fact, and I don't quite know why we all seem to do it. This is a paper some of you may or may not have seen, and I'm very grateful to my colleague Jeremy Brecken, who uses this on the wire bending course. You may notice 1 or 2 names. Mr. Burney, I think you may see as one of the examiners. Equally, one of the best scientists that applied science to orthodontics was Norman Waters. And wherever you see a paper with Norman Waters on, whilst a lot of the mathematical formulae were actually complex, the basis of the science in it was very, very sound. But the interesting thing is, and if I go back to there, some of you feel you have to put a figure of 8 on this to try and make it look even better. I don't know whether it's you're trying to show off by your manual skills, but you are aware that the placing of the figure of 8 elastomeric ties increases the friction by a factor of 70 to 220%. Now, if you want to lock up your system and get nothing moving, figure of 8 ORMLAS are one of the easiest things to use. You may want to do it, you may not want to do it. But let's go on to Alex Cash's paper, the famous paper of the evaluation of slot size in orthodontic brackets. It's very interesting that supposedly science is not influenced by commercial things. And I'll come up with you in a little while as to what has happened. But we were interested, thinking that 022 by 028, we wanted to see what the size of our brackets were. We didn't go to the companies. Alex took them straight off clinic and he got a series of brackets and we measured them. And what became apparent of all the ones that we bought, there were different geometries. It was parallel, divergent, or convergent. When we measured them, and there were 10 in each one, and we looked at the standard deviation, again, it's entirely up to you whether you take value of standard deviations or standard errors. Just to remind you, a little bit of statistics, which should irritate you all, but I hope it doesn't put you to sleep. One standard deviation is actually 66% of the population. 2 standard deviations is 95%, and 3 standard deviations is 99%. But we found in some of the brackets, they were very, very good. And one of the first things we noted with the Clarity MBT prescription brackets, these used to actually fracture the wings quite a lot when we used to use them. And I suspect the problem here was they were made too accurately. There was only a small variation of 2.54%. We then go into these other ones, and you can see, and I'll highlight them for you. The Discovery Roth ones had a 17% variation. And at the base, it was nearly 24% variation. That's not very helpful when we're trying to be precise with our mechanics. The best one of all, I have to say, which does explain why it's able to move teeth very, very quickly, was the Damon. There is a significant variation here, not as much obviously as one of the previous ones, but if you have a small width of bracket and you have a variability of slot, this explains why the teeth move quickly, because basically they will tip very easily. And it's very important you start looking at these brackets to realize and try and understand how accurately they're constructed. And unfortunately, if you're a good orthodontist, you will never, ever be happy at home, because the builders will never be able to produce anything that is a perfectly straight wall or a perfectly set light. It'll always be slightly out. But if you can start to look, you can see that this is actually one of these convergent brackets. This doesn't look at all proper and symmetrical. And again, looking down at this, you can see there's an issue. So we're starting to see that the bracket slots are not right. So that got published in the Angle Orthodontist. In fairness to the Angle Orthodontist, they took it brilliantly, very, very quickly, and wanted it published quickly. I then believe, I can't possibly say, but I then believe they were put under pressure by some of the advertisers that this was not helpful to the advertisers, for the companies that were supporting these. So when we came to do the same thing with molar tubes, we started to get a little bit of problem, and it was a struggle such that we never ever got them published. And basically we looked at the molar tube dimensions, again, we're looking at 022 by 028. It's not helpful, I know, that we have to convert it to metric, but that was one of the things we did do. And that is the dimension you should be looking at to try and get the correct size. Now let's look at what we found with these. The second molars, the slots were always larger than the size. So they were never, ever the right size. I've always struggled to apply torque to second molars. And this is possibly one of the things that explains it, because the size of the brackets is not consistent enough. We looked at various manufacturers. For those of you that don't know, it shows you how long ago we did this. Hawley Russell was a manufacturer. They've now gone bankrupt, but 3M, Orthocare, these all exist. And you can see that there's a wide variation in the 0.55 dimension, and there's a variation in the 0.71 dimension. That's for the 6s and then for the 7s. So these are actually difficult in terms of how you actually can fill the slot with a piece of wire that will actually apply the levels of torque you want. And worse than that, when we started to look at some of the actual inside of the slots, I mean, I'm sorry, I did have a view, and I did like orthodontics, thinking it was a very precise mechanical specialty. But you can see from these views, the slots are not made at all well. They have a lot of irregularities on the surface, and this yellow box represents what should have been the size they claimed to be sold at. Same applies here. I've had to sort of modify the outlook of this one just to fit it into the one image. Normally I witter on about this for hours on end, so I'm trying to limit how much you have to listen to me in the evening. But you can see these slots are not at all well produced. It is important that you are aware of that. I just noticed a question and answer. Let me just quick. May I know how will the mechanics section right, we'll come on to that at the end. That question
one prestigious approach of it at the end, I think, there, Fraser.
Yeah, we'll do that one at the end. So this is clearly one of the problems. So we've got the slots are wrong, we've got the tubes are wrong. Let's look at the arch wires. The other interesting thing in terms of the law, the orthodontic arch wires we use are medical devices. Their production should be subject to the highest standards, and the outcomes for the treatment, hopefully with all our devices we're using, needs to be predictable, consistent and reliable. Now, if we're starting to have a problem with the slots and the brackets and the molar tubes, we hope that the arch wires are better. Well, guess what? Here's one of the arch wires, and immediately, without even looking at it too closely, you can see that the surface is not smooth. You can see it's rounded at the edge. All these things make you wonder, well, how precise is this mechanical work we do with orthodontics? That's it just close up, so you can see the shadow and you can see the defects in it. We did put this all together and looked at various arch wire sizes, and I'm not going to spend too long on statistics, but you should actually know a bit of statistics. The great thing for all of you now is statistics is something that you can all learn very, very quickly if you use Google or DuckDuckGo to actually search for it. Even just a simple 5-minute search will come up with a software package that will do a power analysis. You can even find some software that will actually analyze the mean and standard deviation of somebody's published results to see if their probability is the same level as they report in their paper. Because I can assure you, having been editor, you don't always see the truth in the papers that are actually published. You also do need to know a little bit about non-parametric and parametric data, and you also need to know about distribution of the data. But if we look at these various pieces, this is the analysis looking at the 0.019 inch of your arch wires. The red arrow represents what it should be, and that is what it appeared on the height of the micrometer caliper. And you can see with the various arch wires, there is a variability. You can see particularly some of the stainless steels do spread quite a bit. And here you can see copper nitro. It's not the cheapest wire, but you can see that's actually undersize. And here the Highland stainless steel has got a broad range. That doesn't mean to say don't buy these, but be aware when you're buying them, what you're buying. So if we then go on...
Somebody's asking there about how can we use an 016 as an initial aligning wire in severely crowded cases unless it's a copper nitride. I know my own thoughts on that.
Well, my own thoughts are you don't have to fully ligate in every bracket. You can actually partially ligate. And I have to say, I've never yet come across, so I don't use 012 and 014. The students seem to enjoy using it, but I think it's a bit of a waste of time. If you actually do use the correct ligatures, you can do effectively rotation ties, you can actually do stretched ormolasts. All of these things will work. So I wouldn't say that you need copper nitride to actually align the first arch wires. 016 nitride is probably the best. And if you're running a practice, I would say that's probably better than anything else. I don't know what...
I'd also say, Fraser, that no three 016 nitrides are the same necessarily. There's been a few studies showing that you could take 3 016s and they all give you slightly different variations in the force levels. So it's about the wire that you use and get used to a certain extent and know that you can tie in and use, like you say, partially.
Yep. And then the 022, I mean, honestly, if you use... So I've got a slightly different view. If you teach people, it's not my view of doing anything. Ideally, I'd like people to have done a 3-year course and actually have tried different ways of doing every single thing. So don't take my view of it. The next 6 cases you bond up, 2 of them set up with copper nitride, 2 of them set up with 016 nitride, 2 of them set up with 010 stainless steel, and see how they align. And you make the decision, not me, but I know from bitter experience what has happened. I know what the shortcomings are of some of them. One of the things I get very...
So I think that's great advice, because it's only with experience you'll find which wires work best for you.
Mm-hmm.
Somebody's also asking about 2020. That's an arch wire I use and was put onto by David Tidy. It's great for vertical flexibility when you're picking up 7s, and I use it fairly regularly as a stepping stone arch wire. Is it something you've used?
No, I tend to, if I'm going to do that, get up to a very thick 020 round nickel titanium, or to try and, again, a lot of them, they expect the arch wire to slide in, and a lot of the times they don't slide in. You've really got to deform the arch wire. So you actually have to then, for example, put a length of it in and then push it backwards. And it takes a bit of force, but certainly I would suggest, again, try it, see what you like. Everybody's different, but I've never used 020 by 020 regularly. It may be that it's not quite available at GSTT. What I do use a lot of, and I think is fantastic and greatly underrated, is braided rectangular wire, direct. And you can actually put something like 60 degrees of torque in that and know it's not going to do a lot of damage, but will actually correct the torque and the tip of the teeth quite well. But again, people have just got to pick up, go to the shows, look at what's available, and try some of these things. If there was a perfect solution, we'd all be using it. I don't know of any perfect solutions out there. Is that another?
No, I agree. I think everybody wants what archwire sequence do you use and think there's a recipe book. Well, there isn't. It's a bit of experience and going through things.
No. Is there a fourth question? Is there a difference in root resorption rates? Root resorption is another thing. And those of you that know me, I've got a pet publication, which I don't quote in this one. And our Scandinavian colleagues, I'm very grateful for them, Malmgren and people like that, where they actually gave patients a 3-month break in using continuous arch wires. Now, the great thing is in the United Kingdom, we seem to be slightly constrained. I can understand why it was there, but the British Orthodontic Society guidelines has pushed a lot of people to not taking radiographs. And I have to say, when it was produced, there were some practitioners taking too many radiographs, and worse than that, were not even reading the radiographs or interpreting them. So the British Orthodontic Society guidelines is good, but I think people have to be cautious how far they go. In Scandinavia, they will take full mouth long cone periapicals, or used to. They are changing their views a little at the start of treatment, and had no concerns about taking them again during treatment. And in this particular study, where they gave a 3-month break, giving the 3-month break to the roots actually meant there was less root resorption. Now, there's all sorts of theories and nobody's really explained it, but I'm fairly sure continuous loads do not allow the capillaries to open up to wash away the breakdown products of metabolism. But there is no real proof of that. But it seems to be the one thing I can say as an explanation. Oh, there's 8 questions now. Okay.
Oh, there's more questions coming in. Let's move on for now, Fraser, because a few of these are sort of repetitions, and we can come back to it as well. I'll interrupt you if I think there's one that.
Right. Okay. I'll leave it to you, John. So that's the 019, and then the 025. Now look at the variability of this. Now, don't forget, I mean, we've got a few we've sneaked in that were 21, 25, and 16, 25, but they are supposed to be 25. And you can see there's a huge variation of some of these 25s. It is a big effect that it's going to have on our mechanics. And the important thing you must start to realize that height dimension, 3 of the wires we looked at were undersized, 2 were oversized, 5 wires had no difference. And in the terms of the width, 3 wires were undersized, 5 were oversized, and 2 had no difference. But the interesting thing that the postgraduate did, not me, he decided to then look at the effect of the cross-sectional area and multiply the 2 together. And when you get the combination of the 2 variabilities, look at the amount of variability there in the cross-sectional area. It is huge in terms of what we're purchasing. Now, going back to what I say, I wouldn't say you don't purchase these wires, but you must be aware of what you're purchasing so you know what to actually do. And here we see, oh, sorry, I better put my battery on. Here we see that there is a significant undersizing of the arch wires. It's quite a dramatic effect it will have on your clinical practice, which explains why we do struggle with 1 or 2 of the interactions of the brackets and the arch wires. The results of this then, 100% of the sample had undersized cross-section, despite some of the wires being the right height or width. The wire height was the most consistent, that's the 022 bit. Now the next thing is we need to look at the edges. And this is where we looked at the edges with respect to what was going on. And you can actually see there's a huge problem with the edges here. It is important you're aware of that, because each of these edges causes, like we had with the ceramics, it will gouge into your arch wire, it will gouge into the bracket, and it will slow up tooth movement, which is why a skill that's slightly being lost, but it should be taught a bit more, is this friction-free closure of spaces using loops should be taught a bit more. But you must be aware that there is inadvertent use of irregular size wires which may compromise the treatment outcome. So you always go back to what the clinical outcome looks like. And you don't always have to take a lateral skull radiograph to evaluate what the angulation of the teeth is. So here's some cross sections.
Fraser, can I just check the slides are moving on? Because we've got some attendees saying they can't see the slides are moving. Can you just check through again?
So I'm on conclusions.
The minute we're still on results.
No, I've actually...
You've moved on. Christina, can you help us with that?
That's results. Have you got the two squares on that one?
No. Can you go back down to your slide changer at the bottom, Fraser?
Yeah, I'm on it. Have you got those two slides?
No, I'm still on results.
Right, let me come out of this. I'll start again. Apologies.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Thanks.
All right, I'm still here. Sadly for you lot. Let's get. Can you see that? Oh, sorry, no, I'm not sharing. Sorry. Let's get out of that. And then we want Zoom. Let's start share again. Can we see that blue square?
Yeah.
Yes.
Right, let's try again. That's still there?
Yep.
Right.
Yeah, that's good.
That one, has that changed?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
moving through.
Lovely, excellent. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. I tell you, I've got a skill set with technology that works wonderfully. So going on to this, you've got three hopefully there. I'm not looking for confirmation.
Yeah.
Lovely.
All looking good. I'll let you know if things aren't moving on again.
Right,
Fraser.
okay, so we've now got three different sorts of arch wire, and you can actually see there's a variability here of the actual service, which again is going to cause you some issue in terms of what will happen with regard to the friction as you try and slide it through. So what we then did is try to analyze some of the services, and these are some of the images we've got. Stainless steel, Damon stainless steel. The reason I put that up is it used to be, I haven't looked at the prices recently, but they do try and charge slightly more for Damon. Copper nitrile, so you've got this issue here. So again, if you're using copper nitrile, you've got to think of when you are actually trying to get the teeth to unravel and to slide around the arch wire, you've got to try and counterbalance the flexibility of it. And we're not touching on the business of Young's modulus or the graphs, but you've got to think of how all these service irregularities might actually impinge on the bracket itself and stop the tooth moving. Fortunately for us, I believe that mastication releases that impingement and causes deformation of the arch wire, deformation of the tooth in its socket, and you'll get a bit of release, but it doesn't always. And in cases, particularly where there is strong bone, adults where you will notice that there's large masseters, as I've mentioned before, you will find this difficult. But we did look at the service irregularities and put a measurement on it. And we found that the order, tungsten molybdenum alloy was one of the roughest ones. One of the smoothest ones just is the cheapest stainless steel you can buy. So you do not feel you have to spend money. Don't pour money at a problem thinking it will improve things. It doesn't always. And these are some of the bracket slots. You've all seen these, I'm sure. There are all sorts of ones available for you. Certainly, I find the ones, the Innovation R seem to be the best ones in terms of the active torque. The passive torque, I wasn't over keen with them, but everybody has a different approach. And again, you've got to look at this objectively as students. You should actually try and use an example of different brackets on similar patients and get your own feel as to what you think is the best. I do feel that all the ligatureless ones are slightly overpriced, and I don't think they are economical in terms of how we should run practices. I did investigate, so we were paying £2.50 per bracket when I first took over at GSDT. We were able to get that down to 70 pence a bracket. And I did approach one company where I could go to certain, to India and purchase a full set of 20 brackets for, I think it was $15. And I said, why can't I purchase them from India and bring them into the UK? There wasn't a very, how should we say, a strong commercial will for that. And they did say it was all down to the market forces in the particular country. But do look around for the cost of these brackets. And as I said, don't think the most expensive ones are always the most efficient. Now, this is one of the best ones I love. Lace backs. Again, a postgraduate did all this. We did make mistakes in this study, but there are a lot of things we should have looked at and we didn't. And I'd like most of you to leave here and try and get a long ligature and take it and put 2 mosquitoes and see how easy it is for you to stretch this 010 stainless steel. It's actually very, very easy to stretch this wire. Now, while I've got it, I will explain that whilst I don't believe that lace backs do everything everybody says, but it's entirely up to all of you to try it. So I'm not saying don't use them. I'm saying use some objective view. When you put them on, please make sure they're tight. And when you look at them next time, see if they're loose and they need tightening. Now, the people that support it say, well, that's because they've worked and they've actually helped retract the free. Another view of that is, actually, all that's happened is masticatory loads have stretched these, the forces have been applied, and you might have retracted the three. I don't know, it's for you to look at. The point I was trying to make, which we didn't really get a chance to look at, is whether, as this is yet another piece of material in the mouth, this acted as a plaque retention factor. And was there an increase in gingival deterioration as a consequence of this? That will be for your next generation to do. And so please, I would hope somebody will look at that properly. We looked at 60 adolescents, so there's a reasonable number. It's quite a broad age range, but not bad. And we looked at first premolar extractions and assigned them randomly to experimental with the laceback and control. Lateral cephalograms, I'm not sure the ethics would allow us to do this. There is one very good technique I have heard, but I don't know that they're doing it anymore. At the Royal London, they used to put in the aligning arch wires, and once they got to an 018 stainless steel or a 1725 stainless steel, they took a lateral skull radiograph and then analyzed that lateral skull radiograph to see what had happened to the labial segments. And on the basis of what had happened to the labial segments, they then designed what arch wire they were going to use to either retrocline the labial segments or keep the labial segments where they were and bring the buccal segments forwards. But this just tells you how we went about it, or Robert did it. What was very interesting, because we all think that one of the things that happens is we procline the lower incisors. Well, in this particular study, I still don't know how it's happened, but it did. So we're reporting what's happened rather than what we thought should happen. The lower incisors retroclined, both with lacebacks and without lacebacks, which seems to go against what everybody else says. The difference between the two was no significance. In lower incisors extruded, that's another thing that seemed to happen. We did try and keep them to all the same malocclusion. I do believe that different malocclusions will behave differently. That's one of the reasons why, as a profession, we've identified that there are different malocclusions, because obviously the facial form creating those malocclusions is different and the way they behave. In the ones with lacebacks, the lower first molars showed more mesial movement than those without lacebacks, and this was significant. Now, don't forget, we only looked over a shortish period of time, but if you want to burn anchorage, using a laceback is probably one of the best ways to do it. It is very handy. And again, I'm not saying to you, don't use lacebacks. I'm saying to you, when you put them on, look at what you're using them for, look at what they do, and analyze what they've done between visits. There's still a rocket science statement that seems to be said to some of the postgraduates when I said, before the patient leaves, with whatever mechanics you've put on the patient, can you please take a record of the overjet, the centerline, the canine relationship, and the molar relationship? So when you see the patient in 6 weeks' time, then we'll know what's changed. And that's very, very important when you're trying to monitor it. Now, obviously, in lockdown, that was not as possible as we all thought it could be. But do try and make sure, we're now coming out of lockdown, do make sure you keep an eye on what is changing visit by visit. That way, then, we won't get 6-year treatments or 7-year treatments with very little happening. We showed that labial segment crowding decreased in both groups, with and without lacebacks. We showed that there's no difference whether the laceback was there. And we showed that the arch length decreased in both groups, no difference. So one of the few things we can actually show is that if you want to drag the molars forwards, you use a laceback. That may be what you want to use. And what I'm just coming up to is the last slide or so, is what we need to look at is the bracket slots all vary, the molar tubes vary, the arch wires vary. Ligation can restrain tooth movement, in other words, how you put the armrest on. Again, the same applies to quick legs. You should really put them on tightly and then just undo them slightly, or even just stretch them with a probe in one of the corners. And the lacebacks don't always aid the planned tooth movement you want. But the final thing you should do is look clinically what's going on. And for some reason, we seem to be de-skilling a bit, which we've all got to start practicing. Now, if we take the slide at the top here, which is my last slide, I don't think it would take much neuronal activity to see that these lower incisors are actually retroclined. And this is the same patient showing that they look retroclined. Start to look at these patients, even if you do send them off for radiographs, and review what angulation they are. And this final one, which I think is a lovely case, because the patient is not at all happy with the outcome of this, but the upper incisors are proclined, the lower incisors are proclined. Keep looking, and the problem you've got to try and train yourself is when the bracket's on, it's not as easy to view the angulation of these teeth in terms of what angulation they are in the labial segments. So do keep looking and looking and looking and get an eye for it. And it's not unfair to say that some of the best orthodontists that taught me were self-taught, didn't go on a course, and they didn't need a lateral skull to judge what angulation the upper and lower incisors were at. And that's because they looked at every case and they started to try and judge things before they sent them off. So on that basis, John, I am finishing my lecture and we can now go to the questions if you want. Shall I stop sharing my screen?
Fraser, that was absolutely perfect timing, as expected from you. Thank you very much indeed. Lots of really positive stuff coming through. We'll talk a little bit in a moment about the plans or the changes with the exam and how this may be related to that a little bit. A couple of questions came in. Somebody was asking if you've got a high maxillary canine, wouldn't it be more anchorage preserving to use an 012 night eye rather than 016? I know my thoughts, but what would you say to that?
I would say no. It's more likely to break, more likely to fracture. You do want to get it moving. you should assess the anchorage as a separate thing in terms of the vertical forces. No, I'd still say 016 is better.
Yeah, I mean, again, you can partially ligate your 016. If you wanted to use an 012, you could add in a base arch wire. There's lots of ways of managing that. I think that's what you need to gain from this. The experience with some different arch wire sequences and trying them out in your own hands is particularly helpful. Somebody was asking about center lines and where you put the dot on your arch wire if your center line is off.
If I can be bothered to find it and focus, I'll try and put it. I'll try and put it in the right place. But again, I can remember I used to put them rigidly in my training stages, and you could actually see that you were forcing, rather than actually taking the patient's arch form, you were forcing them into the arch form from the packet and the shape of that, which wasn't necessarily right. And I suspect, which is what I do, I'm fairly convinced it's the case. I suspect most patients have a degree of asymmetry, which we're trying to enforce from the packet. And again, the work from Seattle is very clear that the intercanine distance, how many people take the arch wires out of the packet and change and check them with the first arch wire dimensions of the intermolar and intercanine. And in fairness to Dirk Weikman, I have no commercial interest in him whatsoever, so I'm not selling anything. But when you do get these lingual cases, you send up the start study models, and one of the things they will do is plan the arch wires to the dimensions of the canines and the molars. And again, you have to make a decision, but the world seems to be obsessed with center lines. And that last case I showed where the center lines were on, the patient is upset that the center lines are out, and I still can't see how they're out. But personally, I don't think center lines are as big an issue as everybody makes them to be.
I think when they're within a couple of millimeters of the facial midline, it's not a huge issue. And particularly in the lower arch, I get rather worried that candidates will carry out multiple extractions in a well-aligned lower arch just because it's a couple of millimeters off from the center line, and that worries me significantly.
Sorry, I was just trying to adjust my appearance as I look slightly hypertensive.
We can see you. Right, let's move up. Damon Ultima brackets, do you have any experience of those? Apparently they're supposed to express the full prescription. I think advertising has its part to play there.
Yeah, again, people have got to try it. How much are they selling those brackets for? I've never bought any.
I suspect they're not on the cheaper side of things.
Yeah.
How efficient are stopped arches in conserving anchorage?
It's a skill set that we've lost and we need to use. They are very efficient. And if the arch wire is constructed properly, it will significantly support the anchorage more than. So again, centerline seems to be one fanatical thing that people have picked up on. The other things is TADs. And people think they have to put a TAD in every patient to get it to work. And actually, if you're to use a stopped arch in many cases, that will work far more effectively than a TAD will. So I don't think personally that one TADs are as needed as everybody says. And I do think a stopped arch is very effective, but it's got to be made properly.
Yeah, I think they're fairly simple to bend up as well. You know, I don't think that this is difficult mechanics. It's just not perhaps being taught as frequently now. Let's have a little look. Can you summarize the difference between push, pull, and sliding mechanics when you would use each of these?
So it depends on the case as it's set up. Again, people have got to get into the habit of looking at the molar relationships and the incisor relationships. If, for example, you've got a large overjet and you're trying to get the canines into class 1, you don't want push-pull, you just want pull mechanics, so you want the power chain on that. If you've got class 1 incisors and you're trying to make space for a lateral incisor so you can bring it into the arch, then it's very helpful to have both. So you're opening up the space for the lateral and you're retracting the canine at the same time. But again, it's a bit like you intimated earlier, is there a shopping list where you actually use this change of arch wires? Every case must be judged on its own merits.
I mean, if you're correcting a centre line at the same time, those sort of mechanics work great when you're pushing things open. But if you don't want to flare your incisors forward and your centre line's perfect, then you might just try and pull mechanics and reinforce your anchorage once. As you say, you need to look at each individual case, don't you? Somebody's asked about reverse curve of Spain mechanics and what arch wire you would use for that, because obviously there's a couple of different options out there.
So in theory, if we put the brackets in the right place, we shouldn't need reverse curve of Spain mechanics. But the biggest single thing which takes postgraduates to about the third year to get their mind into this, if you sweep in a curve of Spey into 1925 and then don't correct the torque, the risk you run is you throw the incisors into the lingual cortical plate. We've heard about root resorption. That's not always the thing that's a big issue in orthodontics. The big issue in orthodontics is, are the teeth moving how you want them to move? Now, if you've all bonded the sevens or banded the sevens, you can't then see if there's any change between the 6 and the 7. And if you've actually put your reverse curve of Spey in the lower, and it's thrown the lower incisors forwards and thrown the apices into the lingual cortical plate, if you hadn't attached the 7s, you would see that the 6s would sink. And that's a very good time to see and adjust things. But a lot of people, the fact we haven't got talking turrets on clinic is a big difficulty, because people do need to understand torque in rectangular arch wires. And I think you have to be very careful that when you do put a curve of Spey in, you also flick the lower incisor roots forwards as well in the cancellous trough.
I think also the effect on the buccal segments and how you change the torque buccally for them as well. Often it's a question I ask in MORPH. If you're going to put your reverse curve of Spey in, what is the effect of the torque on the whole arch wire, not just the lower incisors? So yeah, I think it's interesting. Well, we've only a couple of minutes to go. I wonder if you'd like to mention anything about the new changes to the exam, Fraser, and your thoughts on it. Some people are aware of it, some people aren't. So some people seem a little bit scared by it, but I don't think they need to be. It's more routine stuff.
So like most of these things, so I was very cynical of the written paper, but I can understand why the written paper came in, because years ago, I sat down in the dip orth for one question. I was given 45 minutes to answer it. Then I sat down in the MSc paper and I was given an hour to answer exactly the same question. So I can understand why we actually sort of said that we would exempt ourselves. I know I'm talking about the written paper, but I will come on to the mechanics bit. And basically, having that written paper now that it's been, I mean, Pam Ellis has done a fantastic job, and she's actually now handed it over and it's developing, going from strength to strength. It's very, very easy to pass a written paper if you're on a proper course. If you're on a weekend course, forget it. We've done the statistics now and it's very clear. Now, the same applies with mechanics. We'd actually changed the cases anyway, so there were no longer these trophy cases with these parchment booklets, and they were cut down to very bare essentials. Toby Gilgrass had cut that down significantly, so we asked on the progress. Personally, I think there is a need to make sure we're far more consistent, because I always said when I was chair of it, a person could come in with 4 treated cases, 3 of which were impacted canines. They could then go to the viva and there'd be a question on impacted canines, and they could then go to 2 of the unseen cases and they might have impacted canines. And at one point, I did toy with the idea of having a sheet that each student took from station to station so that previous examiners could see what had been asked and they wouldn't ask the same question. Now we're in a position we can actually cover a lot more of the curriculum by having this targeted mechanics. And it's nothing to be frightened of. It's exactly what you do at the chair side. You look at the case, you evaluate what's happened since the last visit or the last stage of treatment. You need to identify what's gone well, what's gone wrong. You need to say what mechanics you can use to then change that. And you can then say what you would see at the next stage of treatment. So actually, I think it's natural progression. The problem I had, which is why I sort of had a bit of difficulty, is getting the number of questions available. And I know that some sister colleges have run exams where the new format questions have appeared on the internet, on eBay, almost the day after the exam. So the Edinburgh College does tend to do it in a very robust way to make sure there can be security of the exam. But that does take a lot of volunteer time. So as far as candidates are concerned, read the curriculum. If you haven't got that, you don't deserve to sit the exam. And actually download the blueprint and the other documents that are there for you to actually assist your education. I don't think...
And that will include a sample question as well,
yeah,
that will be going up on the website. So for those of you sitting the exam next year, please look at the website. In the new year, we will be holding a webinar to talk a little bit about the mechanics side of the exam just before the MORPH. So it will give you more information, but please always keep up to date by the Royal College website. Fraser, you've been fantastic. It's been a real back to basics talk, but basics, I think the candidates don't realise that's what we want them to know well. You know, a good orthodontist is somebody that knows the basics of their appliance and how to use it well. I think you've covered some of those brilliantly today. We've had the largest turnout ever for a webinar, so you get the crown as the largest number, 275, which I think is a fantastic number. So on behalf of the college and everybody present tonight, I'd like to say thank you very much for a fantastic talk and for answering those questions beautifully. And I wish you well and see you all soon. Thank you very much indeed.
I'll go and get some suntan lotion.